All right, now that you've had some time to mull over the thought of Thomas Hobbes, let's address a few different ways that a Thomist might respond to what we find in Hobbes. The reason why we're doing this is because at Hacks, we're really dedicated to the school of Thomism. Hacks is, of course, Holy Apostles College Seminary, the great institution to which you belong. And so, when we approach various philosophers, we're going to be approaching it from the Thomistic angle, which means that we are going to be trying to understand how St. Thomas would interact with these philosophers. And I think this is especially important with modern philosophy because modern philosophers do quite a bit of responding to or rejecting certain principles that they find to be problematic in medieval and scholastic thought. Now, the problem is, I think, that many of the modern philosophers totally misunderstood the authentic doctrines of the high scholastic era and were more or less responding to some of the decadent Thomism, or the decadent Thomism, especially decadent Aristotelianism of the very late scholastic age. And this is going to come with a lot of misunderstandings and poor arguments against positions that most of the great scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure never actually held. And so in defense of the scholastic age against the modernist, it's good to hear some responses from that point of view. And it challenges many of our own ways of thinking that we've adopted simply by living in a society that's postmodern philosophy. Now, I don't mean like postmodernism, the actual philosophical system. What I mean is like after the advent of modern philosophy. And so, now, you don't have to agree with any of the conclusions that I arrive at in my criticisms of the modern philosophers or any of my philosophical positions at all. I'm not going to give you a worse grade for disagreeing with me. In fact, one of the best papers I ever read was when I was TAing for this exact course. I think it was a year, maybe 2 years ago, and somebody had written it in defense of Berkeley's idealism, and he wrote a great paper. He did his research. He argued validly. He went to the right sources and everything. It was beautiful, but he was wrong. And while he got a 95 on the paper, he got a lot of comments. He got a lot of responses, and it was very helpful for both of us because I actually had to wrestle with Berkeley's idealism in a way that I really hadn't done almost ever. And I had to also articulate St. Thomas's positions in a way that the student could understand why the arguments that he was making don't actually apply to the authentic doctrine of Thomism. Now, even beyond this, the debates between the different schools, I think this is an aspect of our pursuit of truth, is that when we're studying certain positions, we need to see what might be some problems with them and try to underline not only where we disagree, but also where we might happen to agree with them. But it's also very important for us to make sure that we're eradicating bad philosophy. In fact, that's exactly why C.S. Lewis said that it's important for Christians, or important for good philosophy to happen, is because there's bad philosophies out there. One of the best reasons to get into philosophy is, well, you have to combat a lot of bad thinking. And unfortunately, bad thinking can be the order of the day for most people. Mostly because, that was a broad claim. You see, you guys, right there, I would have nailed myself, I would have pegged myself for making a broad claim if I was in the lectures, if I was in the discussion forums. But anyway, my point is that it's not typically common for people to sit back and really think about their worldview and compare it to others and play with ideas by studying the history of philosophy and logic and thinking through what they believe. It seems to be the case, and I guess I could probably find some statistics on this. I've seen the statistics that usually people adopt the point of view that is either inherited by them or inherited to them by their parents, or received through media consumption and their closest associations. Now, that doesn't necessarily make those beliefs false, but it also doesn't necessarily make them true either. What we don't find is a real critical evaluation of one's worldview according to sound philosophical principles, which is fine, I guess. If people want to live that way, go ahead, but they're not living life to the fullest. And so, here at a Thomist college from a Thomist professor, you're going to be receiving different criticisms of the modern philosophers on a weekly basis, because what we think impacts the way that we act. The way we act influences the way, or impacts and decides the way that we are and who we will become. And I care about who you become. So I want to help you guys become the best philosophers and best people you possibly can become. And so I'm going to give you Thomism because I think it's the best philosophical system there is. Anyway, let's hop right into my criticisms of Hobbes. So first, Hobbes, as we mentioned, was a materialist. And now, if this is the case, how do we respond to that? Well, I think there's two basic ways to respond to materialism in general. The first way is to prove that there is this, there is such a thing as an immaterial intellect, and that we can speak meaningfully of it. Secondly, we can also note that we don't have to speak about different kinds or different ways of being in a univocal manner in order for it to be meaningful. And so, just with that brief preview, let's jump right into it. So, if Hobbes is correct that everything is made out of matter, then there can't be a God, right? Or at least not in the Thomistic sense of God as an ipsum esse subsistence, a subsisting act of being itself, who is not only free from all matter, but free from all potencies whatsoever. And now, even Hobbes' God, as made of finite matter, just won't work, because this isn't going to be the God of Christian theism. Yet, at best, you might get to Mormonism, and Mormons have their virtues. I have some Mormon neighbors, and they're some of the best and kindest neighbors I've ever had. I don't think I've ever met a Mormon person I don't like. But to be honest, as speaking as a theologian, their theology is wacky. I compare it to like spaghetti thrown up against the wall. A lot of it doesn't stick together, and it kind of just falls apart at some point, and a lot of it seems to be contradictory. It looks good, though, because spaghetti is delicious. Anyway, remember that the soul here is also out. So if it's the case that there is no such thing as, well, anything beyond matter, then there's no such thing as a spiritual human soul or an angel or anything like that. And this, again, this refined matter just isn't going to work, whatever that happens to mean. Now, Hobbes says we can't speak meaningfully of spirit, because according to him, we can only speak about it via negativa. I'm going to move my camera over a little bit here because that's going to make it look nicer. No, it's not. It's too direct. So you're supposed to be like in the side or like in the bottom third of the thing. You never want to be like dead center in the camera. Anyway, move on. Moving on. The ADHD is winning right now. Like, and so we can't speak of anything spiritual or non-material, because we can only say things of what it's not. We can't actually make any sense of it positively. And if we can't say anything of it, well, then it seems to be the case that it's not even real. How can we say that that a thing is real but doesn't have any meaning? That doesn't make any sense. And so if this is the case, if this is his argument, which it largely is, there are two ways, I think, to respond to this objection. And the first one is to demonstrate the existence of something material, such as the immaterial human intellect. And the second is to talk about analogical predication. So, number one, the proof of the immaterial intellect. And this is basically how it goes. So, and in order to understand this, we kind of have to dive back into our metaphysics, or at the very least, philosophy of nature, but really I think this is more appropriately found in metaphysics. So when we talk about forms, we don't see forms in the world that are just like floating out there in the wobbly wobbly space. We're not Platonists as Thomists, and it's really hard to argue for Platonism, in my opinion. I think Aristotle did a very good job of putting an end to the idea of exemplars in the Platonic sense in his book on metaphysics. I think it's chapter 3 or book 3. Highly suggest a reading. Check it out. But for the Thomist, following Aristotle, he would say that the forms exist either in the mind or they exist in the things, in this particular concrete things of the world. And we find the forms in these individual concrete material things, like in this dog Fido, this dog Lassie, this dog Spot. And the form is not some separate goo or substance or ectoplasm that's like spread all over the matter like some sort of glue. But rather what it is, it's the principle of action, it's the internal principle of actuality and unity that brings the matter together to act towards one common and united end. And so there's this, and that's what Aristotle and St. Thomas would call a nature. So it's just this nature that exists within the individual. And when it exists, when a form exists in things in the concrete world, it's never apart from matter. At least when it comes to material things. Now, when I'm talking about angels here, angels are pure essences. They're well, but form and essence are the exact same thing. Don't worry about that right now. But my point is that when we talk about the things of our immediate experience, we find forms existing in individual material things and not apart from them. Again, we're not going to find dog form floating out there somewhere. And so the problem, the thing here is that when we consider forms that we find in individual things and think about them, so when I think about Fido, Spot, Lassie, I notice that they all have the same thing. They have this dog nature, whatever that turns out to be. I'm not going to get too deeply into the details about this canine mammal right now, but we all understand what a dog is, even if we don't give it a very specific definition in this very moment. Now, we could go down that route, but it takes a long time, and that can be difficult. But what we do find is that this form or this nature that truly does apply to Fido, Lassie, and Spot is something that applies to them all equally, and it's something that is abstracted from the particularizing matter that is in the individual material existence in the world. And so what we have here is we have our intellect encountering something in the world, taking on the sensible forms, putting it together, having a phantasm, and using that phantasm to access reality. And that phantasm allows us to access reality, and then we can get another phantasm of another dog, and another dog, and another dog, and then eventually we start saying, whoa, there's something common in each one of these. And so you pull out that bit of commonality between the Shih Tzu and the Doberman and the Mastiff and the Chinese hairless crested, and you figure out, boom, this is dogginess, whatever again that turns out to be. And it's something that's abstracted, that's taken from these individual material things. And so, what the intellect does is not only receives things immaterially, but what it does is it converts the nature which exists in the concrete things of experience as in matter, and then pulls it out of the matter, and then now has it as something that abstracts from that matter. But, as we've talked about before, and this is, I think, a super important point here that people sometimes forget about the arguments for the existence of the soul, or the existence of the immateriality of the soul, is that a thing can only act insofar as it acts according to its nature. And since what we see the human intellect do is take concrete material natures, or natures that we find in concrete material things, which themselves are not existing apart from the matter that they're found in, we take those concrete individuals and take away the matter, so we cause it to be immaterial and we cause it to be abstract, meaning that it's not instantiated or concretized in something that's individual and material. And what this would mean then is that since my mind can cause something to become immaterial, then it must be the case that my mind, or my soul, because my mind is a power of my soul, my intellect is the power of my soul. My soul has an immaterial aspect to it in order to cause something else that is at one point material to become immaterial. Likewise, no form can exist in a material thing in a universal way. But if my mind were made out of matter, then this universal form that I have of dogginess or squareness or rectangularity could not exist in my mind, because again, whatever exists, whatever a nature or a form exists in a material thing, it exists in a concrete singular way, and it doesn't exist in a universal way. When I think about humanity does not exist in my son. In the universal way. Otherwise, every person would be my son. That's not the case. Not every person is my son. My dad is certainly not my son. I am certainly not my son. I don't even know how that would work. But the thing is, excuse me. The thing is that whenever we have a universal a universal form, what we can know is that it doesn't exist in a material thing. Because if that were the case, then all things of that kind would simply be that thing. And since it's the case that I have the universal form or nature of treeness or dogginess or squareness or whatever it might be existing in my mind, then my mind cannot be made out of matter. And so whatever is not matter is immaterial or spiritual. And when we talk about something being concretely spiritual, like my soul or like God or like concretely material, like God or soul, my angel, like guardian angel or something along those lines. What we have is something we call spiritual, because immaterial and spiritual, when we're talking about a concrete thing, is basically the same thing. So we have a spiritual intellect because we cause things to become immaterial and universal, and because we have universal concepts, then it is the case that we cannot be that our intellect, intellectual powers cannot be themselves purely material. Now, what this gives us is something that is immaterial. This gives us an intellect that is spiritual. And we can define the intellect not simply as a thing that is not material, we can define it rather as something that understands the universal natures of things. So, what this means is that there is something meaningful and non-negative or even positive being predicated of the human spiritual intellect here. And so, it seems that Thomas Hobbes' argument against immateriality being meaningless is, well, wrong. It's off the mark, and it doesn't actually strike with a deadly force against the Thomistic's conception of spirituality and of predication regarding immaterial things. And so we can't simply ignore here what reason proves is real. And so we argue and we can deduce from what we know about the world as known through the senses, which is the proper Thomistic procedure, and discover that there is such a thing as the immaterial intellectual soul in man. And if the material thinks that the spiritual intellect is meaningless, and we show an argument for the existence of a spiritual intellect as that which understands the universal natures of things, then the materialist's understanding of the intellect is wrong. And so he either must refute my argument or cease to be a materialist, if the materialist is going to be honest about his philosophy, or at the very, very least, have the confidence in his materialism shaken quite a bit. Additionally, we can speak analogically of spirit. So, sure, when we talk about, we can't say what spirit is in its essence because we don't directly have tangible experience with spirit. It's not something that we see through the normal human process, through the normal human process of understanding the essences of things. But rather, what we do is we plumb out the essence through an a posteriori argument. And what that means is that we understand the nature of the thing by its actions, just like we talked about before, because we know that a thing is always bound to act according to its nature, and we find that the human intellect, even if we don't experience it directly, insofar as like seeing a spiritual human soul, but we do see its actions, and from its actions we can deduce its nature. And this is similar to the way that St. Thomas argues for God's existence in the Summa through his 5 ways. We can speak of God as the cause of material being, or the existence of material being, and the immaterial intellect as the cause of thinking. Sorry, there should have been a comma there. So God is the cause of the existence of material being, and the immaterial intellect is the cause of reason or rationality, or the abstracting, the abstracting of natures found in matter into things that are universal and abstract in themselves. I don't know why my hand keeps drifting this way. It's like I'm reaching for a drink or something, but I don't have one, which is unfortunate. In any case, so when we and the reason why we can do this a posteriori reasoning is because whatever is contained in the effect somehow pre-exists in the cause, and whatever perfections of being that we find in an effect, we have to say, and we have to predicate, exist in the cause somehow, pre-exist in the cause somehow, whether virtually, formally, or eminently. And whenever we find perfections of being in the objects of experience, we have to again find them preeminently in God. And whenever we find the human intellect abstracting things into something that's immaterial, from the material natures that we find in our everyday experience of material things, then we can say that the human intellect is at least as spiritual as the abstractions it produces. And so, just transferring over to God now, we can say that God is good or intelligent or powerful while retaining the same general meaning or character of the term as we find it in creatures, even if the full meaning of God's goodness, power, or intellect is not fully understood, because even this partial knowledge is true knowledge. And a lot of the times what we do with the various divine attributes is, and whenever we find a perfection of being, whether it be unmixed, an unmixed perfection, which would be something like power or love or intellect or life, or by transcendental perfections like goodness, or being or beauty or truth. What we do is we remove all limitations from the way that we understand it as creatures. So God has intellect in a way that's similar to our intellect, I guess, or that's meaningful insofar as he understands the universal natures of things, but we can't say that he does it through the same limited sense that we have. And so it's true that God understands the nature of things, but we understand it through all this sensory input and discursive reasoning and judgment and this huge complicated process, and we require experience and things outside of ourselves in order to actually understand and learn about the world around us. But God, on the other hand, knows things perfectly in his one infinite act of perfect existence. And he knows these things through a reflection on his own nature, because he is the cause of all things, and all the perfections of being pre-exist in him, and we only have these perfections, and all the perfections of beings, both individual and as kinds, are just are vague imitations of who God is. And so since it's since God has this knowledge of himself, but he has it in one simple act rather than and he knows all the natures of things, and he knows it through himself as the cause, and he knows of everything both in terms of their species and in terms of the individuals. We can say, and this is all just one simple act, we can say of God that yes, he is intelligent, but he's not intelligent in the same way that we are. It's a vastly different kind of intelligent. So there, what we have is we have an analogical way of speaking about God. The same general meaning, which is understanding the universal nature of things as an intellect, is the case with God and human intellectual creatures. But the way in which that perfection of intellect or goodness subsists in God, or is found or predicated of God, because God doesn't have any. There's nothing we can. He doesn't have properties. He has attributes. We say things of God based on our understanding. So that intellect that we attribute to God is really there, but it's just not in the same sense as when we attribute intellect to God or to man. Sorry. I hope that's understandable. And so, since it's the case that we can say things and we can speak of different realities and different ways of thinking, in a way that's not just univocal, meaning with the exact same, precise same intelligible content, or the exact precise same meaning in the exact same way, then it doesn't seem to be the case that we can't. It's not the case that we have to speak only negatively in terms of spiritual things, because at the very least we can say that material things and spiritual things are beings; they have existence. And so we can speak of things, spiritual things, analogically, sort of, just like how I was talking about a minute ago about the intellect in man and intellect in God. Or if we want to take it back a notch and not talk about God, we can talk about life. Life is something that's predicated analogously both of man, when we're talking about metaphysical predication, not logical predication. I guess don't worry about that right now. But really, this is what I'm saying, is when we look at life, we have life, which is an internal principle of motion and rest. And it's an internal principle of self-motion, I should say, and self-perfection. And so both man and plants have this principle of life, but the way in which the way that we find life in plants is vastly different than the way that we find life in man. We both are alive, yes, absolutely true, but to say that human life is the same as plant life is to say something false. But it's not false for us to say that humans and plants both have life in the general sense. And we can know this fairly quickly. If we think about simply the goods for human life and plant life in general, there needs to be reproduction, there's going to be nutritional intake, and there's going to have to be some growth of some sort. However, how those things happen is very different in man. Just with respect to nutrition, it's good for a plant to be buried in the ground and watered frequently and get plenty of sunlight. Now, if you did that to me, I would be upset on many occasions. One, for many reasons. One, I don't want to be buried in the ground. It's cold and dark in there. Two, if I were watered frequently, I'd be terrified because I can't swim. In fact, I've almost drowned twice. Well, I can swim better now because I had like a 12-year-old kid teach me. It was really sad and pathetic. And three, look at the skin. Think I could stay out in the sun too long? I literally turned purple once, and my freckles turned green. I looked like Barney the dinosaur. And not only was it socially embarrassing, because that is one heck of a way to look, it was extraordinarily painful. I couldn't sleep for like days, and I bathed in aloe vera and this other stuff called the Master's Miracle, which I don't remember what it was made out of, and I can't find it now, but it was the best sunburn lotion I've ever found. So clearly, me as a human being, the way that I need to live is going to be way different from the way that a plant needs to live. The goods for a plant are very different from the goods of the human, but we can still both say that we have life and that we have these common goods, which are nutrition, growth, and reproduction, that are essential to what it means to be alive. But the way in which that life is found, or the way in which that life operates, depends upon the nature of the thing that you find, the perfection that you're predicating of the thing. And so we can speak of spirit in the same sense. We can speak of spirit as a being and talk about spirit being intellectual. We can talk about spirit being having life. We can talk about spirit having all sorts of different predication, or we can predicates or attributes that we can say of material beings. But those perfections that we find in them aren't going to take on the exact same character, even if they have the general character that we find in material things. So there's an analogical predication that exists between material things and spiritual things. Okay, so those are two responses to Hobbes' materialism. Let's move on to his epistemology. In particular, is what we call the empiricism. And so, where's my thing here? Check out this one. Yes, that one. Okay, too many things open. All right, so Hobbes is empiricism. So remember that Hobbes says that we can only know what we find in the senses, and that our knowledge is limited precisely to what we and that our knowledge is what's going on here? Anyway, so Hobbes argues, sorry, I don't know what's going on with that. Hobbes argues that we can only know what is contained in the senses, and that what we know through the senses is what we know in the senses is all we can have access to. And now there's some truth to this. And when a Thomist responds, we say, yes, knowledge starts in the senses, but does not end there. This is like a moderate empiricism, or moderate empiricism, because we say that there's more we can take from our sense experience than what is actually communicated through our sense experience, than what our senses know themselves. And so St. Thomas would agree again that all knowledge begins with sense experience, but doesn't end there. Reason leads us to conclude that there exists both an immaterial soul and an immaterial God, for instance. And we experience a material changing world, but the existence of that change necessitates a first-son mover, for example, who is the very act of existence subsisting in itself, or God. So right here, again, we have this example of how our senses can, through experience and through reason, lead us to a knowledge of something that is unknown to our senses. So empiricism is not true, or this strict empiricism is not true. Now, just to reiterate that, basically what I'm saying there is that if the strict empiricism was true, then we would not be able to form these an argument for the existence of an immaterial thing or an immaterial being like God, who is the cause of the existence of things that we experience. And the reason why I say that is because we don't experience God sensibly, but we can come to know God through his causes. Another response. So strict empiricism, the empiricism we find in Hobbes, is actually self-defeating. And here's why. So the doctrine of strict empiricism goes like this. All knowledge is sense knowledge, and only sense knowledge, and nothing but sense knowledge. In other words, there's nothing we can know beyond what we find known in the senses. But here's the problem. Again, the doctrine of strict empiricism cannot be proven through sensation. Where do you find it? What does it feel like? Does it smell funny? I mean, exactly. How do you find the doctrine of strict empiricism in your senses and known precisely as strict empiricism in your senses? What does it look like? I don't know. Well, you see, eliminated or this really strict empiricism is simply impossible to maintain under its own criteria, and is at least unproven, but honestly probably false. All right, so there's some more problems with Hobbes' epistemology. Let's move on to that real quick here. Let's see here. I belong. Whoa. I belong here. Up here. You guys let me know. Do you like me in the top corner or the bottom corner better? All right, how we know our ideas. Remember that Hobbes says that we only have knowledge of the sense images that are present to our mind, and that in fact our images might not actually match reality. And so whatever the world does to our senses, our sense organs, produces this image, which we call the phantasm. And for Hobbes, all we know is the phantasm. In fact, I think I have a lecture on this in my that I had to make for my logic and epistemology course a few years ago. I'll link that. But what this means is that if all we know is our sense image that's in front of our minds, then we might not actually have any real knowledge of the world around us. And so here's my first response to that. So St. Thomas would say, on the contrary, our ideas are not that by which we know. I'll also note that Hobbes believed that our ideas or our sense images often got in our way. And so, if it's the case that we first know our ideas, not the real world, then all sciences are simply matters of assessing how our ideas relate to one another. Obviously, this is a huge problem. If that were the case, and all sciences would ultimately be reduced to psychology. Because if all I know are my own ideas and their interrelations, then I'm not really doing physics or biology or anything else. I'm just doing psychology, and like the worst kind of psychology too, where I'm just sort of affirming my own thoughts and trying to find confirmation within myself and my own ideas that I already have that are pre-established and that are precisely my ideas. So what else can I know? Instead, we don't just merely know our ideas. Our ideals are, again, that by which we know, meaning they help us know the real world. Now, you can bite the bullet if you want, then have fun being an idealist and living in your own world. But if all you know is the result of what's in your head, and what's in my head is different than yours, then how can we determine whose truth corresponds to reality? So this reduces very quickly to a extreme relativism, where we say that each person's truth is precisely their own truth, and there isn't a common truth that all of us share together and that we all have access to. So not only is truth something that becomes purely subjective, but philosophical reasoning or reasoning and arguing at all becomes, at most, Nietzsche here, a power struggle. Whoever's the strongest, whoever rules the day, whoever rules the roost, is going to be the one who gets to determine for everybody else what reality is. Now Thomas, by way of contrast, again says that I keep saying again so much, says that our ideas are that by which we know the world, and the same intelligible content in the external world and in my mind are in the same, just in different packaging. So it's analogical. So it's analogical. So the way that we should talk about this is that we understand the essence of things, and the essence itself remains unchanged, but the act of existence to which it is joined in the real thing is a different act of existence than what's conjoined in my mind. Because in the real world, in the world of the external mind, the external world, there is the essence is united to a real act of existence, but in the mind it's existed to a cognitional act of existence. And now the cognitional act of existence is taken from the real act of existence of the thing that we know. But the point is that the essence is the same. So the intelligible concept of the thing in front of us is the exact same intelligible content that we have in our minds. And then it's that the act of existence that is different between the two, but they're corresponding to one another. And so another important part to know about this is that the proper object of any power in the soul is that which stimulates it to act. And so what this means is that according to St. Thomas, we first encounter being, so ens, so a thing that has existence. And that jumpstarts our intellectual process of abstraction, composition or division, which is also known as judgment, and then which is crowned by a proposition. So this man is red, or this man exists. And then, of course, deliberation and reasoning. Now, our ideas either map onto reality accurately or not, but what we first come to know comes from reality and is judged by it. And what I mean by this is that, for instance, it's true to say that a dog is a vegetable than to say that a dog is an atom, because at the very least, a vegetable is both material and living, whereas an atom is something that's just material. Now, both characterizations fall far short of the reality of what it means to be a dog. But when one approaches the reality of Fido, but one approaches more closely to the reality of Fido or Lassie, that is to say that Fido or Lassie is a vegetable, even though it's the case that she's a dog, because at the very least we're saying that there's life. So our mind is more accurately reflecting the reality of the thing in front of us by saying that she's a vegetable, than saying that that Lassie's an atom. Now, our phantasms just help us figure out how all our ideas and senses are related to the one being, Fido, that's in front of us that we're trying to understand. So, for Aquinas, again, the phantasms and our ideas merely help us understand what's in the real world. They're like bridges to reality, but they aren't what we first know. What we first know are real things, which cause the phantasms and give us ideas. Hobbes thinks our ideas and our phantasms actually get in our way or obstruct the truth about the world. But rather, so St. Thomas would, again, deny this, and that because the sense objects are the things which, by saying that Hobbes is thinking about this all the wrong way, is that the first thing that we know is the real world, because if all of our knowledge comes from the senses, and the real world, the things of the external world, cause our sense powers to activate and start the whole intellectual process, then the first thing that we know isn't our ideas, but actually the things of our experience. I'm tapping my money jar here. It's not a spare jar or anything. We just have like spare change lying about, and always seems to be played with by my son. All right, second response. So, does the idea reflect the reality? All right, I'm just gonna quickly run through this one because the last one's kind of long. So Hobbes holds that the phantasm is qualitative, while reality is merely quantitative. So the phantasm, we know, does not reflect reality. In which case, all of his reasoning about bodies in motion, his entire philosophy, is in fact null and void. Now, this is a real problem for Hobbes, because his entire philosophy is built around his knowledge and sense of the world. However, if what he knows are his qualitative phantasms, then, which then, according to their own premises, are not quantitative, he cannot have any knowledge about the real world whatsoever. Because, again, for him, the real world is only comprised of quantitative or primary features. All right, let's move on to what I think is one of the most demonic ideas in history of philosophy: nominalism. Let me edit this real quick. Boom. Oh no! Why is this here? Go there. There. Better. All right. Okay, that's irritating. I'll load this. Anyway, here we go. So, nominalism. For Hobbes, there is nothing common between triangles, humans, dogs, or any other kind of thing. Rather, we only group things together because they look quite similar. And now I think that, again, like I just said, I'm going to stop saying again. I will not say again for the rest of this lecture. I think that nominalism is the most demonic, and I use the term advisedly. Philosophical doctrines ever cooked up. Why? Because it completely dispenses with reason's access to the natural moral law, which we'll see later on this semester. And you'll see if you read these two fantastic books, two of the books that have had the most profound impact on me. The Sources of Christian Ethics by Servius Pincaris, and the book After Virtue by Mortimer Adler. No, not Mortimer Adler. Alistair McIntyre. Mortimer Adler's good too, though. But anyway, it's horribly destructive. So it's important for us to understand why nominalism is false. Here are a few problems. First, think about universals. Redness, triangularity, dogginess, cattiness, whatever. We think of different triangles participating in some common characteristic or form. For the nominalist, remember, there is no common reality in which a thing can participate at all. However, here's the problem. Redness or triangularity is not reducible to any particular red thing or a particular triangular thing. Instead, they are more than particulars and more than individuals. But how do we know this? Well, I know this because all red things and all triangle things could go out of existence and then pop back into existence later on. And what this means is that redness and triangularity is not dependent upon some particular, but are actually over and above the particular, at least to some extent. Furthermore, red and triangular things exist even when no human mind is thinking about them. In other words, a thing's triangularity redness exists independently of human minds. And so think about triangularity. It's a three-sided polygon. While triangular things instantiate triangularity to a greater or lesser degree, triangularity is something that's discoverable in the world of things, and abstractable from particular instances of triangularity. Some universals, it seems, are very, very inescapable. You can't run away from the universals. They will find you. And they have universals have a long career of being speculated about in philosophy and demonstrated over and over again in one form or another. And this long career has given them skills that they have now to make men like me quake, or men like Hobbes quake and tremble with fear. They will find us. They will kill us. I don't know, it's a quote from that movie Taken with one of the coolest actors ever, Liam Neeson. So, speaking of discoverability, the nominalist method of classification suffers from what I call the vicious regress problem. So, the vicious regress problem goes like this. Sorry, remember that the nominalist gives a group of things a common name because they resemble one another somehow. For example, there are 7 billion humans on Earth. There's just there's no humanity. Instead, there's just 7 billion individuals that closely resemble one another that we group together for convenience sake. Now, the problem here is that the commonality by which a nominalist will group a certain set together as a kind actually becomes itself a universal. For example, if we take a stop sign and a fire truck, we can call them both red because they resemble one another. Likewise, grass resembles the Hulk's skin because they're both green. But why are both characterized as a resemblance? Is it because the resemblance resemble one another? Do they resemble one another? And so on. So we have 2 more cases of resemblance here. Stop sign and fire truck are a case of resemblance in that they are both red. And we have grass and the Hulk's skin as another case of resemblance in that they're both green. But wait, the plot thickens. Both examples share in a common trait, which is that the resemblance resembles one another. Yes, that's right, the resemblance resembles a resemblance. Okay, this becomes a problem here, because this is because the nominalist denies that anything participates in the universal. Well, maybe these 2 instances of resemblance are named a resemblance, but because they resemble one another, but the problem is that the resemblance is characterized by its resemblance by the things which resemble one another. You just can't chase down something to the rock bottom. You're not finding anything that is entirely individual, and you can't avoid these universals. You have to appeal to some real universal feature that truly subsists in things. All right, here's another one. Here's another reason why nominalism is wrong. So besides the fact that you cannot escape universalism, at least to some extent, or of at least some form, nominalists suffer from the problem of incoherence. So a nominalist claims that there's no universals, which is to say that such universals are simply names created by intellect. We just name things that look similar, and we give them groups. But then the nominalists are claiming that all human intellects share in a common universal nature, whereby we are able to create universal names. So when they describe the human intellect, they're falling back on universals. And besides, the world behaves, and I think this is another good argument, the world behaves exactly as you'd expect if natures were real, and if natures were real features of the world. So this is a teleological thing. And this would be the what we would expect argument on your slide. Electrons do electron things, which is exactly what I expect electrons to do if they were limited somehow in their nature, or if they were limited by a common nature. Same thing with cats, dogs, trees, humans, whatever. The world seems to exactly behave as one would expect, given the existence of real natures limiting their behaviors to a certain range of action. Now look, there are problems with nominalism, and while there's going to be difficulties for some forms of realism, I just don't think nominalism is going to carry the day forward. Now, if you find a good argument for nominalism that avoids all these big problems that are totally contrary to our experiences and reason itself, go ahead and share with me. I'd love to see it. I'd love to examine another argument for nominalism depth. But I just don't think it's going to win out against Thomistic realism. Okay, now one more quick thing before we get out of here. I want to address very quickly Hobbes' state of nature, where he argues that we are essentially, when abstracted from the reality that we always find ourselves in society, solitary things, and that living in society and being altruistic is something foreign and unnatural to us. Here's a few problems with this view. First, it's patently false. I know that's not an argument, but it seems to be obvious to me. But here are a few reasons why I would say that. First, when we consider our state of existence, we're always born, and what are we born into? A family, a community. And this community is one where, if you've ever been a parent, or have any inkling of what it takes to be a parent, you sometimes want to not do the things that you should do. However, in terms of taking care of your kids, like my son, at 4.5 years old, as brilliant as he is, today we had like this in-depth conversation about God and reality, and then later on he was doing his math like nobody's business, and he was building functioning snap circuits on his own without directions. I mean, the kid's going to be building doomsday weapons by the time he's 9, which is exactly why I decided to sire this child, so that I could have my own evil henchman who builds me weapons as I take over the world. But in either case, it's really difficult to wake up with him 2 or 3 times every night. I get no sleep. I am exhausted all the time. Thankfully, working out like crazy has been helpful with that. But we're born into a family, and as parents, we do things that are totally contrary to our selfish natures, and we're going to be sacrificing ourselves to our children because we love our kids. It's not necessarily out of any obligation or duty, but I truly do love my child, and so our own experience can tell us the exact opposite here. And now, from the child's perspective, we actually find ourselves to be extremely dependent upon our parents for every aspect of our care, and we can do very, very, very few things for ourselves. In fact, the only thing that we can really do and that we're actually free to do as children is to cry or make other noises which communicate our various needs. And this is what kids need. They have lots of different needs in order to survive. Now, because we are born into a community, then it seems to be, and upon whom we're dependent, then it seems to be the case that what it means to be human, because we're always born into a community by nature, is to be in a community. So things act always for the most part, and that's how we identify nature. Now, as we grow up, we might become more independent, but that dependence and our reliance on others remains. And Hobbes actually points this out, that we do need others to survive. But what he doesn't realize is that this actually indicates the social nature of man. And Plato talks about this in his Republic, where if you have you got a guy who is a shoemaker. Well, the shoemaker needs the carpenter to make his tools, but the carpenter needs the woodsman to go chop down the tree, and all of them need a farmer to grow them food, and they need a cook, and they need a doctor, and then they need a politician, and they need a multi-level marketer. What's the word I'm looking for here? They need somebody who can handle trade. Why can't I think of the word? Anyway, so we see in our human society that we have this need for others. And now there's this need for others. We might have our own independence, but on top of all that, one of the things that we can point to that makes us distinctly human is our reason, and our reason is actually borne out in our communication. The crowning achievement of our intellect is the use of reason in making arguments or deductions or inductions from premises to conclusions. But those premises are given through an enunciation or a predicate, where we combine or separate certain ideas from one another. And so our language, but our language isn't just like for expressing ourselves and like grunting and like trying to get out aggression or whatever. It's for communication, and that communication is for other communication. So there's this two-way street going on here, and especially if you consider writing is for the sake of others. The fact that we develop language, and especially sophisticated language, shows us that the human person, and this isn't just something that's done on necessity, this is something that we do naturally. If you watch a child grow up, even if they're not being taught specifically how to speak, they're going to pick it up because, well, it's a part of what they do as humans. And if you I would venture to say that if you drop off a bunch of mute humans who then are medically given the ability to speak suddenly, and they're going to develop some sort of language. This is something that is a part of the way that we encounter life. And when we are lonely and we are solitary, even if we have all of our physical and basic needs taken care of, we're going to be extraordinarily lonely. At the very least, we might need a good cuddle or something like that. We need hugs. We need to be able to be in community in order to be happy. And since the good for nature helps us define and understand what the nature is, what we can see is that because we rely on others, we rely on others, and that we communicate with others, and that we need others for our own happiness, then it does not seem to make any sense at all to say that essentially we're solitary things, and that we only enter into relationships and communities in a secondary sense. So there you have it. There are a few criticisms of Thomas Hobbes from a Thomistic point of view. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the forums, and I'm looking forward to Descartes next week because I love Descartes. Okay, goodbye everybody.